Every time a company launches a new piece of hardware, there are always some kind of launch issues, and ASUS is not immune to that. In fact, they've had quite a few issues stack up around the ROG Ally, and they have been really quiet about it. That is, until now. They finally have addressed some of the issues that people have had with performance on the ROG Ally, with dead zones on the ROG Ally, and with SD cards on the ROG Ally. So let's take a second and look at what they've said and see what we can get from that. Now, I feel like I should point out that I did not get a review unit for the ROG Ally. I bought it on launch day, just like all of you. And even if I did get it early, I'm really not much of a benchmark guy, so I wouldn't have run these tests. But there were quite a few reviewers that got early access to the hardware, and the performance was at a certain number. Then there was a firmware update, and that number got boosted, so all the bars went in the right direction, and people were happy with that new updated firmware. But then on launch day, there was new firmware yet again, and it kind of regressed the frames per second that people were getting in various games down to a lower number, which people were understandably unhappy with. It's been about 2 weeks since that happened, and ASUS are finally responding to it. They're saying, A, that shouldn't be happening, and B, if it is happening and you're getting drastically different numbers, or there's a problem with your SD card, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you should reach out to ASUS and maybe do an RMA. Here's the actual quote from The Verge, what they got on the company's official Discord. They said, when fully updated, including with the latest BIOS 319, and the latest AMD graphics drivers 31.0.14058.4001, which you can download in the My ASUS app. We are seeing performance on par with the launch BIOS version 317. ASUS, that comes from Gordon Winston on the official company Discord. But let's take a look at the actual numbers that ASUS are saying that we should expect in a game like Cyberpunk 2077. So according to The Verge, ASUS claims that you should now see somewhere between 39.95 frames per second in the Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark at 1080p with medium specs and AMD FSR set to auto in turbo mode with the system unplugged. They say if you repeat these benchmarks but get drastically different results with a fully up-to-date system, please reach out to our customer support at asus.com for help. Okay, so Sean Hollister actually ran the benchmark, and these are the numbers that they got. They said that they were getting between 36 and 37 frames per second, which is less than 39.95 frames per second, which ASUS said to expect. Now, ASUS said if you get drastically different numbers, then you should reach out. But I challenge people to define what does drastically different actually mean. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I am not a benchmark guy, but when a game has a built-in benchmark utility like Cyberpunk 2077 does, even I can't screw that up. So I downloaded Cyberpunk 2077 and I set all the settings just like ASUS said to do, and I ran the benchmark utility 3 times, which is what you're looking at right here. And you can see that I got numbers between 33.37 on my first run, 33.05 on my second run, and 33.61 on my third run. Note that all of those numbers are not only lower than what ASUS got, but they're also lower than what Sean Hollister got over at The Verge. And as I've said a million times on this show, I am not a frame rate snob. I definitely don't care about just a few frames per second. What I really care more about is the stability of the frame rate and the frame pacing. But when you've got ASUS giving you exact settings to use on a very specific game and giving us exact target numbers to look for, and I'm getting about 6 frames per second lower than that, that is a little disappointing. But would you define 6 frames per second as drastically different? That's the thing that I don't know. Let's move on to the SD card issue. I recently made a video talking about the fact that some SD cards are failing in the ROG Ally. Some people are positing that the whole reason that that's happening is the placement of the SD card slot. You see, it's right next to one of the exhaust fans, and so people think that maybe it's getting too hot and it's cooking the cards. Now, I have not yet put my expensive SD card in my ROG Ally. I recently ordered a 1TB SD card, the exact same one that I have in my Steam Deck, because I'm a huge fan of it, and it's only about $100 right now. Link in the description if you want to pick that up for yourself. But I don't want to risk putting it in the ROG Ally yet. So I ended up putting an old SD card. I think it was a 128 gigabyte SD card that I just had laying around just to test things out. I still have not run into any issues, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any issues. Now, ASUS did respond to this, and here's what they had to say. Our team is still hard at work testing concerns around the micro SD card reader. First things first, if your Ally's micro SD card reader is failing to read any micro SD cards, or you believe there is a malfunction with the reader, please RMA your device by heading to the website that they give you. We take user reports very seriously, but we would like to collect more data because at this moment, all of our test devices are performing within specifications. So if you do RMA your device, be as specific as possible about the conditions that led to the problem, including what operating mode you were in, what model micro SD card was in use, and what the micro SD card was doing at the time. We will use this data in further testing as we try to identify whether or not there's an issue and what it is. As our first precaution, we will be releasing an update that boosts the device's fan speeds, since good cooling alleviates the types of component stresses that can sometimes cause issues. In the meantime, you can create your own manual fan curve in Armoury Crate SE. Now, there's two things about this statement that stick out to me. Number one, asking the end user to know exactly the conditions in which their SD card failed is kind of a ridiculous thing. What's probably going to happen is somebody's going to boot up their ROG Ally, go to play a game, and it's not going to work. And they're going to be confused for a little bit before they finally figure out that none of the games that are on the SD card work. So how are they supposed to know exactly when and how it failed? The second thing that stands out to me is the fact that they are basically saying, yeah, it's a heat issue, because if they weren't saying, yes, it's a heat issue, then they wouldn't talk about adjusting the fan curves. And lastly, why are they expecting us to solve it by setting our own fan curves? Yes, there are plenty of people out there that know exactly how to set a good fan curve in order to keep the device cool. But I would argue that most people don't. Now, yes, you can set a custom fan curve in the Armoury Crate software, and it's not hard to do. But you bring it up and it's just a graph and you're like, I don't know what to set things at. So until they actually ship a new fan curve update, I am not putting my terabyte SD card in the ROG Ally. And some might say, Bill, are you going to return the ROG Ally? No, I think it's a really good device and there's definitely some issues with it. But overall, I like it. I'm really hoping that all of these issues are simply software related and not hardware related, and I am taking a risk by not doing an RMA yet, but man, $700 to take that risk is a big ask. And if I weren't doing a YouTube channel about this kind of thing, I don't know that I would hold on to the ROG Ally. Not because I don't like the device, but because ASUS hasn't been super transparent. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the joystick dead zones. I have not noticed any problems with the joystick dead zones on my ROG Ally at all. Here's what ASUS has to say about it. In addition, we are still investigating reports about the joystick dead zones. There are multiple variables that contribute to the dead zone you experience, such as the game being played, the launcher, and its controller layer, and of course Armoury Crate SE. Each of these factors can stack on top of each other, and we know that this is a big concern for many of you. We want to make sure that we address it with the thoughtfulness it deserves. Stay tuned for more updates as we are still testing. Now, while this isn't actually giving anybody any solutions, I will say that this statement makes sense to me. You're running different games, you're going to have different responses to your joysticks. You're running different input layers like Steam input, for example. You might have something that is messing with the dead zones in that software, and at the same time you've got Armoury Crate running, which is also doing something with the dead zones of your device. all of these things could stack on top of each other exactly as they said and interfere with the dead zones of the joysticks. Again, I haven't personally run into this issue, and as you can see right now, I'm kind of moving my joysticks around and I don't know what I'm really looking for. I've never been somebody who is super sensitive to joystick dead zone issues. As long as when I push forward, my character moves forward, I'm usually fine with that. And when it comes to like first person shooters where you would really notice this kind of thing, I suck at those games anyway, so I wouldn't notice, and I would probably just chalk it up to me being bad at video games. So I don't have any experience with the joystick dead zone issues, but it looks like ASUS is actually working on it, which is great. I would have liked a solution though. So what do you guys think? Do you think that 5 or 6 frames per second is drastically different than what ASUS is telling us? Do you think the joystick issues are a big deal? And are you going to risk putting an SD card in your ROG Ally? Let me know in the comments section down below that like button. And if you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy this video right here. From the Nerd Nest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, everybody.